Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here to talk with Dr. Moon. I'm very excited about talking with Dr. Moon because her story is pretty fascinating, and I just right before we started talking, I learned a little bit about it, a little bit more about it that I was unaware of. But the nutshell, we're going to get into it here, is that Dr. Moon testified in Washington, D.C. About the COVID vaccine, and then basically just a hailstorm has come down upon her on different levels. And where she practiced as a pediatrician, the school did not renew her contract, and et cetera. So, Dr. Moon, thank you for coming on the show. We're just going to kind of dive right in. So tell me about your background. Like you're a pediatrician, right? Did you specialize in anything in the Washington State area, right?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I have to give my disclaimer, which is that my words today are always only my own. My opinions are my own. I'm not here representing any employer, past or present. So yeah, I was born in America to parents who actually had fled from communism. So I'm first generation. I was English as a second language in my home. We spoke Czech as our primary language, and I picked up Spanish along the way as well. My dad was born in Argentina, my mom in Prague, former Czechoslovakia, and they fled from the hell that their homeland had become. So, I honestly thought that was something that was just an interesting part of my history, like many Americans whose parents came here legally as immigrants. We all are from immigrant families, right? And unless you're 100% Native American. So, but we all have immigrants somewhere in our history. And I worked really hard. I went to a top US medical school. I became a pediatrician, and I specialized in pediatric hospital medicine as well as in general pediatrics. So I'm actually certified in both fields. And I've just always followed the rules, did what I was told, tried to use my critical thinking skills that I was taught in medical school. And I took care of the kids in my region. So I practiced in Washington for the last I think I practiced in Washington State for about 19 years, and 17 years of those were in a hospital setting. So I took care of very ill kids, taught medical students, taught residents, and just tried to be, a decent human being. So,
Well,
and then 2020 came.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I was just going to say doing pediatrics too is kind of hard because not only are you dealing with a lot of times children that can't describe their symptoms, they could just say I'm hurting, but you're also dealing with worried parents, and sometimes I bet dealing with them is harder than, than dealing with the children at times. So you've had to learn how to maneuver complex situations outside of just medicine, that I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. There were always interesting cases, but always someone's child at stake, right? And we did our best. We had in the hospital setting, we would have care conferences that would involve multiple, specialists and caregivers and the families. And you really have to just figure out what's going on in all of these situations. And, try to make things better for that family if you possibly can. Um, so yeah, it was interesting work. I've enjoyed it. I wasn't someone who ever ran for public office. I wasn't someone who ever would have gone on this side of the camera. Honestly, I was a little bit camera shy, if anything. I was always the one on the other end of the camera taking the pictures of just, life. But and then 2020 hit, and everything just turned upside down on its head. I think we all saw that.
Now,
And
yeah, and so how did that impact you? Because there was obviously right away, I noticed that even doctors were more afraid of getting COVID. There was more of that push of telehealth, waiting for a possible vaccine. But you're having to deal with, again, you're dealing with scared parents. You're dealing with children that again we can't quite tell symptoms on. So how did you have to adapt your practice, especially during the early stages of COVID?
yeah. Well, as the COVID epidemic hit or the pandemic hit, I was actually working mostly in a clinic setting at that point. I'd moved away from the hospital world and was primarily in a clinic. And we were all scared, just like everybody. We were watching the TV. We're like, what is this nightmare virus that's descending on our nation? I had kids just terrorized in the office, crying. Parents were crying. I had kids coming in with fevers 102, 103, and parents, fearful their child had this new virus, this COVID. Uh, kids looking at me, it was horrible. Kids looking at me and saying, "Am I going to die?" I've never experienced anything like that. 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds saying, "Am I going to die?" Just terrified out of their minds. And we were all, unsure of what this meant, except for, that we were going to be exposed to this virus. Because as a pediatrician, by the time you leave at the end of your clinic day, my little patients have coughed all over me, they've sneezed all over me. I'm pretty much covered in it, right? So I didn't have any idea that I would, I thought we're all going to be exposed to this, whatever this is. And the clinic shut things down. Initially, I thought that made sense to me because it made sense to not shut down and not see patients, but just to be very careful about our exposures, wash our hands a lot, try to limit the patients that we had to see in person in the clinic setting, and try to do some things by telehealth so that we would limit exposures. And initially that made sense to me. But then I rapidly it didn't make sense. I thought, how can we ever stop a virus from hitting us? This virus is out loose in the world now. It's not just going to go away. And I began to crunch numbers. And by numbers, I mean, I began to crunch the infection fatality rate of COVID, because that was something we just weren't seeing on the news. But I was using our government's own statistics, and I was crunching the infection fatality rate on my calculator. And it wasn't as high as they were making it sound like it would be. Yes, it was terrible for some adults. I'm not downplaying it, but for the kids especially, we just weren't seeing them with anything more than a cold, honestly, in the office setting. And I had, I think, one patient that went to the emergency room for a few hours. And, really, we weren't seeing the severity of COVID be anything that was threatening the lives of our nation's children. So uh, I began to question things very rapidly. And yeah.
Did you start questioning among your peers first, and then and if so, how was that received, and then where did you go from there once you started questioning things?
Yeah, I mean, things were still pretty open. I think in early 2020, we were certainly able to have discussions. We were talking about papers and things that people had read and what their experiences were with their patients. I know I went into the hospital setting on a number of occasions to see kids that we had admitted for other reasons, not for COVID. I didn't admit a single kid for COVID. Um, but I went into the hospital setting for other reasons, and the hospitals were empty. You could hear a pin drop in the hallways of these hospitals that used to be just bustling, busy places. You could hear a pin drop. There was nobody around, and the nurses were just terrorized up on the floor waiting for these COVID patients to arrive. And for pediatrics, we just didn't see that large a number. Now, I'm not saying that kids weren't admitted with COVID. Obviously, like any virus, uh, kids were admitted. All viruses can lead to an admission for dehydration or oxygen needs or things like that. But thankfully, I think we all agree fully at this point, uh, fully, our nation's kids were spared in terms of fatalities. The fatality rate for kids with COVID was statistically a zero. I mean, it wasn't an absolute zero, but it was very low.
So who did you start questioning this to when you started seeing these numbers didn't seem to match the level of I'll say hysteria, but I may be exaggerating that a little bit. But when you started seeing it that they didn't match with what your experience was, your research, with what you were hearing and seeing from everybody else, and you said you started questioning it, who did you start questioning that to?
Really just to myself
Uh,
mostly, and to my, really close colleagues. But, just as I was looking at the numbers, I was thinking, we were the goal, if you remember, the goal they gave us was to flatten the curve. Do you remember that
oh
term?
yeah, oh,
Flatten
yeah,
the curve.
absolutely.
So the hospital system wouldn't be overwhelmed, and that made sense to me. There are only so many critical care beds. There are only so many critical care physicians who can care for those patients who are extremely ill. So even with those really low infection fatality rate numbers, if you have a tsunami of infection that all of a sudden hits a population that's never seen that infection, even if only a very small percentage end up being hospitalized, and then of that number, a very small percentage end up going to the ICU, it still could overwhelm the system. So it made sense to me to kind of have people back off and socially distance for a little bit and to allow the virus to, you know, to run through the population, which it was going to do. It was not going to be stopped in terms of people all being exposed to it at some point, but we could stop the exposure so it wasn't all at once, so the hospitals wouldn't be overwhelmed. So that part made sense to me. What I didn't like as time went on was this increasing um, hysteria and fear mongering that your child was going to die. You know, we had numbers very early on that showed that your children were spared from COVID in the sense of fatalities again. So there was this fear mongering though in the local interview. There were local interviews happening. There were national interviews happening with just tremendous fear mongering towards parents. You know, basically threatening them with this idea that your child was going to die from COVID. And that to me was very wrong. I had some of the area hospitals had press conferences about how they were worried they were becoming overwhelmed and they were getting their ventilators ready for these children. And I happened to know exactly how many children they had in the hospital at that moment with COVID. And one of the hospitals I'm thinking about was not one where I practiced, but they had one child in the hospital the day they held the press conference that had tested positive for COVID, but was there for a surgical problem, I think appendicitis. You know, this happened to test positive for COVID, but had the sniffles, you know. So this fear mongering was happening directly in front of the hospitals with parents completely unaware that the hospital really didn't have any hospitalizations for pediatric COVID at all. And so I just began to be very upset with what I was seeing play out. Parents don't need to be frightened into, you know, doing things that don't need to be done, because there's no fear that a parent has that's greater than the fear of losing their child, right? Your children are your most precious people in your life, and you don't want anything bad to happen to them. So scaring parents with that was wrong.
So you moved from questioning, kind of recognizing, okay, this is getting worse. When did you say, all right, I need to stand up. I need to say something. What was there? Was it during the COVID time or was it when the vaccine got introduced?
You know, it all happened very gradually. This all sort of came into focus. And um, so I can't give you an exact date, but I can tell you I had some things happening simultaneously. So around the time that I began to question the numbers and everything that was being done with social isolation and distancing, I was also in a position where I was teaching our younger year medical students. So I was teaching part time at a local medical school, and I had discussion groups that were being held with students, like I've done my whole career. So, you know, discussion groups are these are graduate students, these are medical students who are just a few years from becoming physicians, right? And so our goal was to introduce them to different ideas, different topics, and have them sit down and really have a thorough uh, talk about those issues. Just like, you know, you and I did when you were in graduate school, right? So, or college. Um, and so around January of 2021, um, there were some conversations that were held. Some of them were in December, some in January, some in February of 2021 and late 2020 that came back at me. And I'll give you my example. So I think it was, I'd have to look at dates, but it was in early 2021, shortly after the rollout of the vaccine, that I was actually abruptly pulled from my teaching in these discussion groups at my medical school by my chairman. He called me into his office virtually. It was all on Zoom. And he told me that the students had alleged that the discussions that we were having in class had caused them trauma and harm, and they no longer felt safe in my classroom. Now, I'm not perfect, but I don't yell at my students, I don't yell at residents, I don't belittle people, you know, I just don't. These were discussions that we were having, we were sharing differing viewpoints. And so I asked him for examples, and they actually pulled me from my teaching, and I never saw those students again. But the three allegations they had against me came out over the next month or so. And they were very clear. One of those was we were having a discussion on racism in medicine. I had not picked the topic, the medical school picked the topic. And my students alleged that when I had paraphrased Dr. Martin Luther King's, you know, I Have a Dream speech, that they felt traumatized and harmed by that paraphrasing of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech. So that was one allegation against me. The second allegation had to do with the COVID-19 shot. This was in December of 2020. I was just socializing with my students, and they asked me what I thought of the COVID-19 shots that were rolling out. And I said to them, I said, guys, I really haven't had a chance to look into the data very much with these, but never be the first and never be the last to jump on the bandwagon of any new product. I said, I do have some questions. What's the biodistribution of this? If it is put into your arm, does it stay in your arm or does it go to other organs? Where does the protein that it's having your body create go? Is it inside the cells? Is it outside the cells? Is it in the cell layer of the lipid layer of the cell membrane? Could this cause immune problems? Could this cause cancer? Could this cause rheumatologic issues? So I was just thinking out loud with them because they asked me.
Right.
And that was the second complaint against me, was the students alleged that I had caused them trauma and harm by having them think about these things and by stating to them that the shot might not be 100% safe. And then the third allegation against me had to do with, again, the students socializing and asking me how my week had gone in clinic. And at that point, I was seeing one child after another in my clinic whose mental health had just been devastated by the social pandemic lockdowns. And so I said, guys, this is not working. I said, our kids' mental health is being absolutely catastrophically harmed. They have essentially a zero risk from COVID infections itself as far as fatalities. But yet these lockdowns are causing them to be suicidal, depressed, anxious. I'm seeing one child after another in the clinic whose mental health has just fallen off a cliff. I said, we need to be rethinking our social distancing. We need to think about whether these CDC guidelines are correct. I said, we need to start thinking about isolating our more vulnerable members of society and letting these kids out there to develop herd immunity. Well, that was the third complaint, that the students alleged I'd caused them trauma and harm by having this discussion with them and by bringing up the idea that we should not be following CDC protocol. So because of these three allegations, I was abruptly pulled from my teaching. I never saw those students again. And I was investigated by my medical school for what they were saying was alleged student mistreatment for not keeping them safe, feeling safe during discussion groups. So all this was playing out around the time that I was seeing these active things happen in my clinic. And it all was slowly coming into focus that, we've lost our control over medical education. We've lost our control over the ability to have a conversation about the best practices for our nation's children. And, your original question to me was, kind of more about the shot and about the policies. I was in a position in my clinic where, as I began to research this shot, I was increasingly worried about giving this to children who, again, had no risk of a fatality, essentially, from the virus itself. So in that situation, you have to turn your thinking brain on and say, why are we giving them an untested product that we have no idea what the long-term side effects might be for an illness that they don't have a statistical risk of a fatality from? What in the world do we think we're protecting them against? So I actually never ordered the shot for a child. I never recommended it for a child. And I began to be concerned because I began to see things in my community that were clearly adverse reactions, not shots that I'd given to these children, but just in my community, I began to see and hear about cases of myocarditis directly related to the timing of this shot. I began I would have lots of examples, but I began to be worried because I know what the normal rate of myocarditis used to be. It was extremely low. And here I was hearing about it in places that I shouldn't have been hearing about it, with a frequency that I shouldn't have been hearing about it with. And so as the year morphed along, I began to speak out more and more about my concerns, but it was a process. Yeah.
So I want to connect. So the words trauma and harm were the ones that the administration, when they pulled you in, they used the words trauma and harm for questioning something which is what science is about, right? Science is to question and to test assumptions or hypothesis So trauma and harm was the words they used.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure those were the words. I would
Jeez.
have to, I have letters actually that documented everything, and I would have to go back and look at those letters directly and make sure. But yes, basically that was it. I was told very clearly that my job was to keep students keep feeling safe in the discussion groups, and that they had not felt safe because of these topics that were being introduced that had made them feel unsafe.
So,
And I
so
remember
who,
I pushed back against my chairman and I said, look, how in the world can anyone teach if we can't teach topics that the students don't allow us to teach? Like, how in the world can we teach?
right.
And the answer was, well, you can still teach those topics, but you have to do it in a way where it's not harmful to them because they've alleged that you've caused them harm. They were crying and were upset that these topics were brought up in class. And I said, has anyone alleged that I yelled at them or I belittled them or I did anything person? And they said, no, no, they alleged that they didn't feel safe in an environment where they were hearing these different viewpoints discussed.
So the topic was so overwhelmingly emotional, and yet they plan on dealing with patients. They plan on dealing with the trauma going into an ER, which is just crazy if you're in an urban area.
Yeah.
I mean, people, that are drug addicts coming in, that's not going to be traumatic for them. But just saying, hey, we need to look at the data of COVID, that's traumatic. I mean, am I oversimplifying what I just heard?
No, I was having a real struggle with the chairman and with the department about this because I kept saying, look, I've taught my whole career. Having a discussion groups means that you have a discussion. It means that you bring up differing
Right.
viewpoints. I'm not telling them they have to agree with anything I've said. I'm just saying these differing viewpoints exist, and that's what a conversation should be held, about those viewpoints and have a discussion about, does that make sense? Does it not make sense? Does the data support this? Does the data not support this? That's what a discussion group, and that's what the very foundation of medicine and science in general is built on, is this idea that we go through and we discuss and we analyze and we critically think and we're open to different possibilities. I said, if the students can't tolerate something that they just simply don't want to hear about, and that makes them feel unsafe, then no professor can ever teach. How can we ever teach? We're just only teaching what they're allowing us to say, and that's not teaching.
The Demas's family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. Demas's is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to demasfamilykitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's demasfamilykitchen.com.
Right? That's
No.
just repeating an indoctrinated narrative. And so we went around in circles with this, and basically I just never saw those students again. And so the department decided that what they would do with me was that they began to allege that I was a racist for having brought up those 3 different things. And so racism must be something that I'm, you know, taking part in. And they had me take a test to see how racist I was. It's an online, I know. This is, I know. Like, who can even take this anymore? Again, I come from a parents who fled from this kind of
Right.
ridiculously terrifying behavior. My mom, when she was in college, she watched as they came after one of her professors when she was in college. They came for him, and they came for him in an adjacent room. She was a college student at the time. It was shortly before she fled her homeland because it had become so terrifying. And she was in an adjacent room. The people that came for her professor had no idea she was hiding behind the door, but she could hear them coming after her professor. They were berating him. They were upset that he had not followed the indoctrinated, narrative that he was supposed to have been following while teaching. And she actually never saw him again. Now, I thought for years, as she told me that story as a child growing up, I thought for years that, it was other faculty or administration that came for that professor. No, I found out recently it was the equivalent of the state police, the local equivalent of the KGB that came for him. She never saw him again. And as much as I heard that story as a child growing up, to think that I became that professor, I'm the one they pulled away for simply having discussions with students in a discussion group. This whole world has just gone mad.
What
I just,
incentive? I guess here's the part that just bugged me about this whole thing, and I've talked with several doctors on this as
Mhm.
well. And what incentive did the administration have? What incentive did the medical school have to, or do you think that would have maintain and push this level of indoctrination that would just be like, okay, we have to say this because it's not like we have KGB. I think we're moving it closer to that direction, but it's not like at
Yes,
this
we are.
stage we have that KGB coming in, the secret police of some level coming in and saying if you don't do it. Was it a funding issue? Was it a status issue? What was it that was creating some of that hysteria from your superiors, do you think?
I have no idea. I suspect, though, that funding would play a large role. So, and I suspect that part of it is also that if any one member of that faculty of any medical school at this point, or of any college, of any law school, it's all fully engulfed nationwide. This is not just unique to my situation. This is happening nationwide. But I suspect if any one of those administrative faculty members, those physicians who are faculty, actually agreed that this was wrong, stepped out of line, they would find themselves on the wrong side of everybody else as well. You know, I think it's peer pressure in large part because it becomes so uh, inscripted, that narrative, that people can't deviate from it unless they all stand up and say, you know what, we're not going to do this any longer. But to have one administrator or one faculty member join me would mean they're coming after their career too. And so I think there's that. And I think we're all handcuffing one another. When did we ever think something like this would happen? So this all, you know, it's interesting because here I am the daughter of parents who fled from communism. My dad was actually born in Argentina. My mom was born in Prague. I speak three languages. I have never been a racist. I resent being called a racist, especially when it came to having scientific discussions about what the adverse reactions could and couldn't be related to the COVID shot and what I was seeing in clinic. That has nothing to do with racism. That's just critical thinking. And paraphrasing Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm not even going to grant that whole idea any sort of further detail because it seems like it gives it too much this idea that I'm a racist somehow was ridiculous, right? And so they had me take the test, a 15-minute, 20-minute test online to see how racist I am. And I waited eagerly for the results because what are the results going to be? They never asked me any of my family background. They never found out that I was English as a second language, first generation to medical school in the United States, all the things that I represent. So I took the test and then it came back and it showed I think it was like a 1 in 5 ranking system, and you wanted to get a 5. Like the higher you were, the less racist you were. And mine was a 4. I did really well on their silly test, right? I'm not a racist, but I did really well, even by their own testing measures. So then they're like, well, yeah, I guess you're really not a racist, but but you could always be a little bit better. And so here's some essays you can write, and you can go to some theatrical productions, and you can do these things. And I said, well, after I've written the essays and after I've gone to these theatrical productions, who do I turn this back into? Like, who's going to help me? And they said, well, you don't. It's just a self-reflection. And the whole thing was crazy, but they ultimately put me back into teaching. I had new groups of students, and life was back into sort of more of a normal flow again. I had a new group of students I was teaching for a period of time. And then increasingly, again, I'm still a practicing pediatrician. I was teaching part time at this medical school, only on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. And I was alarmed by the shot itself. I've been pro-vaccine my whole career, pro-traditional childhood vaccines. I didn't question the system. I didn't, I certainly was never anti-vax, but when it came to the COVID shot, I became increasingly professionally concerned with what I was seeing. I was seeing kids coming into my office who'd had the COVID shot elsewhere. Again, I didn't order it, but who were having these weird palpitations. They were having heart issues. It was just weird. And I know what normal is. And I began to question, I began to speak out. And so I was invited to speak at the request of a sitting US Senator in Washington, D.C. And as a concerned pediatrician who otherwise wasn't getting my word out enough locally, I flew to Washington, D.C. at my own expense and on my own personal time off. And the event was held on a Wednesday, a day that I never even teach, never taught at the medical school. I do other things besides just teach. And I gave them a press release that clearly said, I'm here representing myself. I'm not here on behalf of any entity, any employer, anybody. And I spoke at the Senate hearing. And I said, there's an increase in myocarditis. I showed the blank package insert from a box of mRNA product that I'd finally gotten my hands on. Because again, I hadn't ever held it in my hands, but I pulled it out of the box and it had a big package insert that was blank, except for the words intentionally blank on it on both sides, and a little barcode that went nowhere. It said product not found when you scan the barcode. So I showed that at the hearing. I said other nations have shut this down. They're not giving it to their young people anymore because their scientists have shown that the risks far outweigh any theoretical benefit to young people. And I said, what are we doing? We're being censored and silenced. What are we doing? Why are we giving this product to children? And as a result of that testimony, in December of 2022 at that Senate hearing, my medical school then sent me a letter in March. It's public. You can take a look at it. They questioned, whether I'd taken an official personal leave to go to the event. And it was completely personal time. I have documentation to show all that. But then they went 2 steps further. They said in point number 4 that it was their ethical obligation to report me my words at this public hearing in Washington, D.C., because I may have spoken misinformation. And then they also said that I may no longer be suited to teach their medical students because they follow the evidence, and basically alleging that I don't. And 2 months later or so, at the end of June of 2023, they sent me a letter effectively terminating my employment with them by not renewing my annual faculty contract. So the day or two before my faculty contract was to renew, they sent me a letter not renewing my annual faculty contract.
Now,
So I was basically fired.
will you have to report this? So like if you're trying to get certified at other hospitals, because I know like that certification process and it's very lengthy and you have to put down every little thing that could happen, to you. When you go through that, are you going to have to report this on the certifications as well, since they didn't renew the contract, but technically you weren't fired, but they just didn't renew your contract, or that you were accused of being a racist? Or do you have to report this stuff for the certifications, or is that?
It depends on how they ask the questions. Sometimes they ask questions in a way where they don't ask that, but sometimes just to be crystal clear, I practiced in Washington State again for 19 years. I've never had any actions against any state medical license, certainly not in Washington State, but not anywhere. And I've never had any lawsuits against me, despite taking care of my region's sickest kids. I have a crystal clean record of patient care. So yeah, this could absolutely harm me in the sense of having to check boxes.
Right.
Then the school took it one step further. Then after they failed to renew my contract, thus terminating my employment, they actually reported me. There's a letter showing that. They actually sent a report of my public testimony in Washington, D.C., to the state regulatory agency, to the Washington State Medical Commission, the one that regulates my license. And they alleged that I had provided misinformation at the Senate hearing. So they reported my public testimony as a private citizen and as a practicing pediatrician who was there not representing the school, outside the scope of that. They reported my words and came after me. And then the medical commission decided to launch an investigation. They could have thrown it out. They could have said, this is frivolous. She has a right to speak. We have a First Amendment. No, they launched an investigation against me at a point where I actually no longer even had an active Washington medical license, because by then I decided to stop practicing in Washington state. So I hadn't renewed my license under duress because I felt like they were coming after physicians' free speech. So um, they actually came after a physician who no longer even had an active medical license in the state that they were regulating for speaking at a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C., at the request of a sitting U.S. senator. Like, it just doesn't get crazier than this. This is the direct weaponization of our agencies against free speech.
Well, and they talked about your evidence when you're pulling out the piece of paper from a box that was sealed. So it's not like you inserted it in there. And if it did, they would have easily have been able to disprove that, if you had fabricated anything. But they clearly did not. And you show them this, yet for some reason that's like you're spreading misinformation when you're literally showing them exactly what the facts are that are in front of you. You're not even forcing them to draw the conclusions from it. I mean, you're just presenting the evidence, and that's the term they use. I find that interesting.
I find it terrifying. With my family background, I find it terrifying
Yeah,
because, again, this is what my family and this is what millions of other people fled from. And this is absolutely here in America. This I never in a million years would have ever thought that this would happen in our beautiful country, but it's absolutely happening. It happened. It's continuing to happen. They came after me for speaking about my legitimate concerns about the dangers of a product and why we're giving that to our nation's children. I still stand by that. Why in the world is this COVID-19 shot? It now sits on the traditional childhood shot schedule. If you pull up the CDC website and look at the traditional childhood shot schedule, it sits on there for ages 6 months and up under emergency authorization measures. Our children never had an emergency when it came to COVID. The data is super clear with that. So for me to not ask that question would actually have been a violation of my Hippocratic oath to do no harm, right? So to be able to practice medicine ethically, you have to be able to question, you have to be able to state concerns, and to do that at the request of a sitting US senator of all places, and to have a medical school come after you, and to have a state licensing agency come after you. This has parallels that are deep when it comes to what has happened in history past, right?
yeah, and so I can easily see the parallels there. Are you surprised at your colleagues that they didn't stand up, that more across the nation, but even particularly the ones that were you surprised that they how compliant they became?
Yeah. Yeah, many of them see it. They tell me privately, they see it and they say, "Great job. Yay, way to go." But, they say, "I have a mortgage to pay," or "I just bought a new boat and I have to pay off my boat." And I say, they say, "Thank you for fighting this." And I say, "Well, I'm filthy rich. I don't have any bills. Of course, I'm not filthy rich. I've literally lost hundreds of thousands of dollars of income the last few years from this, but I will gladly give my income away. I will gladly do that as long as this nation stays free, because we're going down a terrible path right now. I'm seeing the parallels with what my family experienced, with what my grandfather experienced. We're in such danger right now. It's beyond ridiculous, the danger that we're in. And so I see my colleagues just sitting there and they see it, many of them, and they're fearful. And that's exactly, I think, what they intended when they come after a physician for speaking like they came after me. It is meant to intimidate other physicians. It is meant to show, if you dare question anything as a medical student, as a faculty member, as a practicing pediatrician, as a practicing physician, if you dare question anything, it's going to cost you dearly and we're going to come after you. This is meant as direct intimidation of anyone for speaking out. And we simply cannot tolerate this as a nation. It has to stop.
Eric Metaxas wrote a book a couple of years back called Letters to the American Church, and he was comparing in the 1930s in Germany when Hitler was rising, that there was about a third of the church that was very strong anti-Hitler. There was a third of the church that was in favor of Hitler. But it was that middle group, and the numbers actually, I think I'm even wrong. I think there was even smaller percents on both sides. I think it was like 15 and 15. But the middle group they were just kind of sitting back, waiting to see what was going to happen because they did not want the conflict to come on there. And he theorizes, and I agree, that if that middle group sided with those that were said, this is wrong, we're going to go against Hitler, we would not have had these problems. We would not have had the fascism and the Holocaust and all this other stuff that happened in Germany at that time. But because they sat back, they waited. And I look at these doctors and I'm like, okay, these are people who are obviously very intelligent. These are people who are obviously they persevere, because going through medical school is not simple. Going through residency is hard. I mean, you have that skills and those traits to be able to do that, and yet they're rolling over because of stuff. And that to me is what's so concerning, because if they can control us with our stuff, and then eventually when we have no power, they'll take the stuff away.
They'll take it all away anyway. I mean, that's the thing. My mom recalls when she had just started working under communism, there was a gentleman sitting in the cafeteria where she went to have lunch, and she went and he was kind of ostracized by everybody else. He was sitting there alone, and she went to chat with him, and he was, I think, fairly highly trained. I think he had a PhD. He was very highly trained. But he told her, he said to her, he said, "Honey, you can't sit next to me. I've been shunned by everybody because I've been speaking out about what was happening." And and he eventually was sent away. She believes he went to one of those hard labor camps is where they sent him. The point here is, yeah, they may come after those of us who've been speaking out first. They already have come after those of us who are speaking out first, but they're coming after you, and they're coming after your children and your grandchildren. You have to be in the way of this. The only way to make this stop is for everyone to make this stop. And so I do increasingly see colleagues who realize what's happening, and their workaround is just this idea that, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just not going to recommend this shot for my patients any longer. Well, that works for right now. That does work
Right.
for right now. But think about the fact that there is a whole sea of these products coming through the pipeline. There are more and more coming. There are still mandates out there. If you want to go to medical school or you want to go to a nursing program, in most states, you still have to take these shots. There's no way around that, or you can't get into these programs. We still have young people who have had fatalities from these products. This is this is horrifying. And so if we don't have the ability to say stop, we're seeing horrible things as a result of someone being injected with this shot. If we don't have the ability to stop that, this is a runaway freight train. This will continue to grow and grow and build and build. And what will they inject you with next? What will you be forced to be injected with to go into a grocery store, to go fly on an airplane, to go to a graduate program, to go to college? This is exactly where we're going. And so everyone needs to speak out. More physicians have been. I've been really pleased to see that. I was recently working at a hospital where I was on the phone with a pediatric specialist, and we were talking to the parent. The child came in with an unusual problem, and the physician flat out asked the mom on the phone, he said, has your son had this COVID-19 shot? And she answered, and he said, "Oh, thank gosh, thank God he didn't have it. Don't give it to him." And he clearly knew. And then he paused. You could tell he was worried because I was in the room listening. And I said, "I agree with you." I said, "I fully agree with you." And he said, "You do?" He said, "I thought I was the only one." He's like, "Yeah, don't take this, but we need to see people speaking out much, much more than what we've seen. And we can't tolerate them coming after the free speech of physicians. Even if I'd stood at that Senate hearing, even if I'd stood there and said absolutely everything incorrectly, I still had the right and the obligation to do that. It was a Senate fact-finding event, right? I didn't say things that were incorrect. There has been an increase in myocarditis. I did pull out the real package insert, and I have a witness to my pulling it out. I'm not a fool. I actually had a witness to it. I had a nurse who was standing there with me when we unsealed the box and we pulled this out. I've seen it, I pulled it out of other boxes subsequent to that with other witnesses. So I have witnesses to that. I said, what are we doing? We're being censored and silenced, and other nations have shut this down for their younger people. Those are all factual pieces of information. And I closed out my testimony by saying, this is my anecdotal story that I came to share. I couldn't be more protected by the Constitution if we still have a Constitution. And that's the question I have for everyone. Do we still in America have a Constitution? But more importantly, where does this go? What happens with these medical students and residents who now have been taught not to question,
Right.
not to not to speak out, to stay quiet, to just do whatever the protocol tells them to do? These are your future doctors, America. And there are some really amazing people that are in these medical school classes. I'm not saying they're all agreeing with this. In fact, many medical students nationwide have come to me. I've spoken to many at medical schools across the nation, and they have said to all of us physicians speaking out, we're with you. We just can't say anything because we'll be kicked out of our schools. We won't get a residency program. We will have difficulty with our careers, but they're scared to speak. Yeah.
Well, I think that's the biggest fear of all, and I appreciate your fight for speaking. Not just because I agree with you. If the World Health Organization gets its way, World Economic Forum gets its way with having this new treaty that they're wanting to sign with digital IDs, all of the stuff that's coming down the pike, that if this does play into it, that the medical community is the medical community and the legal community are the only two that are left to be able to fight it. And if these students are learning this horrific behavior now, and there's being trained that way now, what are they going to do later, especially when they come across somebody who's like, I don't want a vaccine for my child? Then are they going to say, well, we're not going to give you anything? We're not going to give you any medical treatment because of it? Or am I, by me saying that, going to cause them trauma and harm? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, if they can use that, which by the way, you talking to me has probably caused me more trauma and harm. Can I join in on the lawsuit? I mean, because I mean it's awful when you think about the consequences of this.
As the daughter of people who fled from this, I absolutely had trauma and harm from having been pulled from my teaching. No one seemed to be disturbed by that. This is what happened to my relatives. This is why I didn't know my grandparents. This is why I didn't know my aunts and uncles. They lived behind the prison of the Iron Curtain. My family, they fled here by themselves. That was it. I didn't have any relatives growing up. I didn't know people because they lived behind the Iron Curtain. The amount of trauma here has been huge, but you're absolutely correct. What does this mean for the future of healthcare? You understand that children already were turned down for solid organ transplantation at a number of medical centers because their parents had refused to give them this untested and frankly dangerous COVID-19 shot. They were turned down for medical care. This has already happened. This is not some theoretical horrible thing that might happen in 5 years if we continue to allow this to progress. This has already happened. I have patients coming to me at a practice that we opened in Florida that have been kicked out of their medical practice for not giving their child a hepatitis B shot. I've had moms in there in tears. They've been kicked out of their pediatricians' offices for not giving their child a hepatitis B shot. Hepatitis B being an illness that you only catch from your mom until you're sexually active. So these newborn babies, the mom knows she doesn't have it. She's been tested. It's perfectly reasonable and sensible for her to turn this down for her baby because that baby is not at risk until they're older and they're sexually active. They've been kicked out of healthcare. The healthcare system is closing down to people who don't follow the rules, and the rules are being run by people who you don't elect, who you didn't put into power, and they're not allowing physicians and other healthcare professionals to even ask questions, as my case and many other cases illustrate. So we're in a terrible, terrible place, and the only people who fix this are the American people. We all have to fix this. Yeah.
Now and we're kind of nearing the end. So you put a lot of these documents that you reference. You have a website on that. Would you like to tell everybody the name of the website? And I'll also put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I have a wonderful legal team that's helping me, but really it's not about me. It's about your freedom. It's about America's freedom. It's not about me. So
Absolutely.
I speak a lot around the country about what's happened because people deserve to know what's happening. Otherwise, it stays silent. You don't even know what's happening. But this legal team has been fabulous. They've been very helpful. I'm not asking for a penny of money for me. I'll survive as long as we're free. I'll be fine. But if you can contribute a little bit to the legal team, that would be obviously very, very helpful because it's for your freedom too. The team is called silentmajorityfoundation.org, silentmajorityfoundation.org. The lawyers are wonderful. They are fighting for you. If you put in my name, Dr. Moon, in the search area of the web page, you'll find a web page that has my whole case outlined that they built. And if you scroll down it, you'll see case documents. You can click on that and you can actually read directly these letters that were written by the medical school chairman, by the medical school department, by the dean of the medical school. You can read these letters. To me, there's like something out of history that I never thought we would see play out here in our beloved America. But read them and draw your own conclusions, certainly. You can see the letters that the Washington Medical Commission asked me, the questions they asked me as they were investigating me for speaking all the way across the country from Washington State when I spoke in Washington, D.C. At a Senate hearing. Again, they came after me. You can see the questions they asked, and you can see our responses to those questions. And please send those out to everyone and anyone who will wake up to the horror of what's happening because yeah, they may have come after me, but you're next. And we need to stop this. So silentmajorityfoundation.org.
Well, Dr. Moon, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on. I'm sorry that you've had to be one of the first ones to get hit with this, but I'm thankful it was you for somebody who's willing to stand up and speak out and on behalf of us. So I thank you for it. Again, I'm sorry that you're going through it. I know it's not an easy task, but from
Yeah.
our conversation, you seem very well equipped, and so I want to thank you for that too.
Yeah, thank you. I just would ask that everyone look their children and grandchildren in their eyes and say that you're going to fight this because it has to stop. We're Americans. We have a constitution and we cannot tolerate this. Yeah.
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do, and even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book, On the Duty of Christian Civil Disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's uncommon at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man.
I'm almost speechless here. It was just it's a crazy story that you wouldn't think would happen in the United States. That we're doing this, but I'm also worried about our future and when we see it. And I'm mostly worried about the fact that we refuse to speak up. And if you notice, a big part of what she said on the reason why we don't speak up is because people were afraid of losing their stuff. And no one wants to do that. No one wants to be able to lose their wife or the ability to travel or to go out to eat or any of these things. We don't want to lose our freedoms, but recognize that our country was started by people who were willing to risk their lives and their freedoms in order to have something that was much better for us. And if we don't maintain that spirit, it's going to continue. Now, part of the problem that we have is the amount of debt that we're in. Bible tells us that the borrower is a slave to the lender, and you can't see that anywhere more than this. which is as soon as we become slaves to the lender, then they have control over us. That's what it means to be a slave to somebody or to something. We can't all get out of debt right away. The consumer debt is rising, our mortgages are high, but we can do whatever we possibly can to start working on that goal and trying to get out of debt as much as possible. Because as long as we're slaves to those people who are going to be telling us what we can and cannot do, what we can put in our bodies or not put in our bodies, what we can say or cannot say, who we can associate with and who we can't associate with. As soon as we do that, we're going to start seeing the fact that we're going to be losing our freedoms left and right because it's too easy for them to control us this way. The Bible is true. We know that. We know the Bible is true in all forms or fashion, but we also know that through that truth, there's practical applications of it now. Get out of debt. Speak up. Use your voices and recognize that there's a potential for consequences by doing so. But we have to be able to do so, not just for us, but also for our children and our grandchildren. So if you like this content, follow us, subscribe, whatever method it is that you are following us through, and reach out if you have any questions, concerns, comments. Again, look at the notes that Dr. Moon, look at the letters. Do your own research on this. It's silentmajorityfoundation.org and do a search for Dr. Moon. And you're going to find that when you look at these documents that she's not exaggerating, embellishing, etc., and that these should cause a lot of concern for just questioning, and that's all we're doing. So you need to think and you need to act and speak out because it's time to wake up.